There are stories buried so deep in the soil of America that you can almost hear them breathe when the wind turns cold. Stories whispered by the dead, covered in dust, hidden behind the polite walls of history books. Tonight's story comes from the red clay fields of Georgia, where one man, a doctor by title, but something far darker by heart, turned human suffering into science. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. They called him Dr. Horace P. Laughton, a physician in the early 1830s. To his neighbors, he was a visionary, a man who could cure disease, dissect death, and lecture on the mysteries of the human body with chilling precision. But to those who lived under his roof, the slaves who toiled in his fields and served in his home, he was something else entirely. For decades, local families refused to speak his name aloud. His mansion, built on the outskirts of Milledgeville, was said to hum at night with voices that didn't belong to the living. And when his journals were uncovered in 1899, in a trunk behind the decaying walls of his study, the town finally learned the truth, and then sealed it again. The journals contained dozens of entries. Most were written in the calm, clinical tone of a physician. But one, dated July 8, 1836, stood apart. The ink was darker, the handwriting more desperate. It described an experiment, a study of taste, flesh, and fear, he called it. That entry would later be used by historians to piece together one of the most horrifying private experiments ever recorded on American soil. If you were to stand where his house once stood, you'd still find bits of porcelain plates buried in the earth. Some of them, they say, still bear the faintest trace of something that isn't supposed to be there, a residue the soil refused to forget. What drove a man of medicine to commit acts so monstrous he was erased from memory? And how did his secret finally come to light? Dr. Laughton's mansion wasn't just a home. It was a theater of anatomy, a place where the line between medicine and madness blurred until it disappeared. From the outside, his estate looked like any other plantation in Baldwin County. A wraparound porch, magnolia trees, the scent of iron and soil. But inside, the air carried a strange chill, a smell of formaldehyde, smoke, and something else no one could name. He'd come from Boston, trained under men who called themselves pioneers of medical progress. He brought with him a collection of glass jars, preserved organs, and a hunger to understand life by unmaking it. His slaves were his property, and in his eyes, property could not suffer. He told himself that pain was just another variable, something to be observed, measured, and written down. Neighbors noticed strange deliveries. Barrels arriving at dusk, marked only with the initials HPL. Some said they contained medical supplies. Others swore they heard faint crying from inside as they were rolled into his cellar. The local preacher, Reverend Epps, tried to confront him once. He left pale, trembling, muttering only that what's being done here is not for the eyes of God. Inside his house, one room was always locked. It had no windows, no furniture, just a long oak table and a drain carved into the floor. He called it his theater. The slaves called it the room of forgetting. Those taken there never came back the same. In his notes, he wrote that he believed human fear produced chemical changes in the flesh, that terror itself could alter the taste and texture of meat. His so-called experiments began as dissections after death. But soon, death became an inconvenience. He wanted to study the transition, the moment when flesh turned from living to dead. And one night, in the late summer of 1836, he crossed the line forever. He gathered 3 of his servants, all young men, and offered them food from his own table. Roasted meat, fragrant and glistening in candlelight. What they didn't know was that he had taken it from one of their own, a man who'd vanished days earlier. And as they ate, he took notes, calmly, methodically. In his own handwriting, Dr. Laughton described the evening as a revelation of the senses. He wrote that the men consumed with great appetite, though the air grew heavy with knowledge. He noted how one of them, identified only as Jacob, stopped chewing mid-bite, his eyes glassing over with realization. The doctor didn't stop him. He wanted to see the moment awareness struck, when the body recognized itself in what it was consuming. According to a later affidavit from one of the surviving slaves, Jacob tried to vomit. The doctor grabbed his face, forced him to swallow, and whispered something that became infamous in the oral legends that followed. Now you know the flavor of truth. After that night, the house changed. The servants refused to enter the cellar. The birds stopped nesting in the trees around the property, and Dr. Laughton, once sociable, once respected, became a recluse. He told the neighbors that his studies had led to a higher form of understanding. Some thought he'd gone mad. Others thought he'd found something too terrible to share. A few months later, new entries appeared in his journal. He described hearing their voices at night, voices from beneath the floorboards, whispering to him. He wrote that their words were not curses, but questions. They ask me, he wrote, why I do not join them at the table. His handwriting grew unstable after that. The clean lines of a physician turned erratic and jagged, each word pressed too deeply into the paper, as though carved rather than written. He began experimenting on himself. Small incisions, bloodletting, consuming bits of animal tissue to approximate the communion of shared flesh. By the spring of 1837, the plantation was nearly abandoned. 2 more servants had vanished. Rumors spread that he was feeding them to the others, not out of cruelty, but ritual. Some locals swore they saw light from his basement long after midnight, flickering like a lantern moving in circles. And on certain mornings, smoke rose from the chimneys that no longer burned wood. When his house was finally entered, months later, what they found was so disturbing that the sheriff ordered it burned to the ground. But the journals, those were saved. Someone, it seems, wanted his words to survive. For 60 years, the story of Dr. Horace P. Laughton faded into local superstition. His house was gone, his grave unmarked, his name erased from the records of the Georgia Medical Society. But in 1899, a group of workers renovating an old courthouse found something strange wedged between the foundation stones, a small rusted metal trunk. Inside were medical instruments blackened with age, a locket containing a lock of human hair, and 3 leather-bound journals sealed with wax. The first 2 were nearly unreadable, eaten away by moisture. But the third, the one dated 1836 to 1837, was almost perfectly preserved. The ink still glistened faintly under lamplight. The first page began simply, "To study life, one must begin with death." The journals were quietly handed to a local historian named Amos Caldwell. He was a school teacher, a soft-spoken man with a fascination for medical history. He began transcribing the entries late at night, alone in his study. Within weeks, his wife wrote that he had grown pale, sickly, and afraid of his own reflection. Caldwell sent a letter to a colleague before he disappeared, writing, "I believe these words carry something with them, something that watches whoever reads." That letter was never mailed. His wife found it years later, sealed inside a desk drawer. And though the trunk was passed between collectors and academics, it never stayed with one owner for long. Each person who studied it either fell ill, vanished, or burned their own notes. One museum curator in 1924 ordered the journals locked away in storage, labeling them "Caution, Bioethics Archive." It wasn't until 1962 that they resurfaced again. A graduate student at Emory University found microfilm copies in the basement archives and began piecing the story together. His research paper, titled "The Laughton Experiments, a Study in Antebellum Atrocity," was rejected by every academic journal he sent it to. Within a year, he'd withdrawn from the program and left the state entirely. No one knows where the original journals are now. Some say they were buried again. Others claim they were destroyed in a church fire in 1971. But every few decades, a rumor spreads that a page surfaces somewhere. In an estate sale, a library, a private collection, and always, written in that same trembling hand, the word taste. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you bury it again? Or open the box and read what he wrote? Those who studied Laughton's work often described the same symptoms: sleeplessness, paranoia, a sense of being watched. Some said they could hear faint chewing sounds at night, like someone eating just out of sight. Others swore they caught glimpses of him, the outline of a man in a doctor's coat, standing near mirrors, watching. A surviving note from the Emory researcher described recurring dreams, a dining table surrounded by shadowed figures. The dream always ended the same way. He looked down, and the plate in front of him was empty, but his hands were covered in blood. When he woke, his bedsheets were torn, as though something had been clawing at them from underneath. Psychologists later dismissed these accounts as mass suggestion, the result of obsession with a dark historical figure. But even skeptics agreed on one thing: whoever came into contact with those journals seemed to change. The eyes grew hollow, the voice quieter. One man burned his own research notes and still claimed to smell cooked meat when it rained. There's an old belief, common among the Gullah communities along the coast, that when someone eats human flesh, even by trickery, a part of their soul becomes enslaved to the one who served it. A taste bond, they called it. That bond never ends, not even after death. Some folklorists think that's why the ground where Laughton's house once stood refuses to stay still. In 1953, a team of archaeologists tried to excavate the site. Their instruments broke. The soil beneath the foundation was strangely warm, as though something living was still breathing below. Those same archaeologists reported hearing whispers, even laughter, from beneath the earth. They left the site after 2 days and filed no official report. But one of them, years later, admitted in a taped interview that before leaving, he saw something buried just beneath the clay. A porcelain plate, cracked and blackened, with a human tooth embedded in its edge. And carved into the back, almost invisible unless held to light, was a single word: remember. By the 1970s, The land where Dr. Laughton's plantation once stood was bought by a developer hoping to turn it into a housing community. The ground was cleared, leveled, and paved. But construction didn't last long. Workers began quitting, claiming their equipment would fail for no reason. Cement wouldn't set. Lights flickered when the sun went down. One man said he found animal bones mixed in with the soil. Bones that looked far too human. Locals called it the Field of Echoes. Even now, people say that if you visit at dusk, you can hear the sound of something simmering, like meat cooking slowly over a fire. But there's no smoke, no light, just the faint smell of iron in the air. One eyewitness in 1981, a sheriff's deputy, reported seeing a figure walking through the field with a lantern. He said it looked like a man wearing an old doctor's coat, but the coat didn't move right. It hung still, as though the air itself was holding it up. When the deputy approached, the lantern dimmed until there was nothing but the outline of that coat hanging in the darkness. Some historians have suggested that what haunts that place isn't a ghost. It's knowledge. The kind of knowledge that shouldn't exist. Laughton's journals weren't just records of medical experiments. They were blueprints of ritual, of communion through consumption. He believed that to truly understand humanity, one must taste its suffering. And maybe he succeeded. Maybe he reached that understanding. Because even now, people say that the soil itself feels alive. When it rains, red clay pools into shapes that look almost human. Dogs refuse to cross the boundary where the house once stood. And when lightning strikes nearby, for a brief second, the ground glows. Not white, but a deep pulsing crimson. The land has changed owners dozens of times since then. None stay long. Some hear footsteps in their home. Others wake to find their dinner plates shattered on the floor. And sometimes, in the quiet between storms, they say you can hear a man whispering softly, as though taking notes. His pen scratching in the dark. Time may erase buildings, but it never erases hunger. The story of Dr. Horace P. Laughton is one America tried to bury. But the ground never forgets what it's been fed. Even now, fragments of his past surface like bone from shallow earth, reminding us that the line between science and savagery is thinner than anyone dares admit. In the decades that followed, whispers of his bloodline emerged. A few descendants changed their names, moved north, and blended into new families. But local genealogists in Georgia claimed that one line, distant but unmistakable, survived. Those born from that branch, they said, often suffered strange dreams, the taste of iron on their tongues, the smell of meat when no one was cooking, and a voice, low and calm, reciting measurements in inches and ounces. Some say that's how history keeps itself alive. Not through memory, but through inheritance. The sins of one man passing quietly through time, finding new forms, new faces. The experiments never ended. They just became invisible. In 1999, a private collector from Savannah claimed to have found one of Laughton's scalpels in an antique shop. It was displayed in a glass case, labeled, "Unverified 19th Century Medical Instrument." He took it home. Within a week, he reported that his dog refused to enter the room where it was kept. He began hearing dripping sounds when nothing was leaking. And one morning, when he lifted the scalpel from the case, the metal was warm to the touch and smelled faintly of cooked meat. Today, the field where the mansion once stood is quiet again. Weeds have overtaken the gravel path, and the air carries a silence too heavy to be natural. Locals avoid it. Children are told not to go near it. And those who do often return with the same story. that they saw a flicker of light under the ground and heard a man's voice whisper, "Taste and remember." Maybe it's just folklore. Or maybe the hunger that drove one doctor to madness never truly died. It just changed its form, waiting for someone curious enough to dig it up again. Because some stories aren't found, they find you.